Some say that Class D amplifiers are the future of amplification. Others complain that many Class D amplifiers change their performance depending on the characteristics of the speakers they're connected up to. The solution, according to some people, is to apply a post-filter feedback loop, or PFFB, but is that really the answer? My experiences with the Fosi Audio ZA3 would suggest that things are a bit more complicated. The Fosi Audio ZA3 is a Class D speaker amplifier that retails for $136. That's with the top spec 48 volt power supply. That's how I reviewed it with the 48 volt power supply, and other than telling you that having a lower voltage power supply will reduce the power output, I can't tell you if it'll change the sound. I can only tell you what I've heard with the 48 volt version. For that relatively tiny amount of money at just $136, you're getting yourself a speaker amplifier that can output 180 watts into a 4 ohm load. But that's also oversimplifying things. If you look at the front of the amp, you've got a switch for XLR or RCA input. And let's get this out of the way now, the RCA input sounds nowhere near as good as the XLR input. It's significantly inferior, and I wouldn't recommend buying the ZA3 if you're running with a pure RCA connection only, whether it's a phono connection or a DAC that only outputs RCA. But it's the other switch on the front panel of the ZA3 that makes things really interesting, and that's the stereo mono switch. Flicking this switch turns the ZA3 into a monoblock, and now it's going to output 235 watts into a 4 ohm load. These figures that I'm quoting are maximum peak outputs, so it's not going to do 235 watts continuously into a 4 ohm load, but that means that you are going to be getting a continuous output of probably 100 watts or a little bit more, but at this point we know it's got plenty of juice for any normal speaker setup. Of course, turning the ZA3 into a monoblock does mean that you're now going to need two of them for a regular 2-channel setup, and that means you're doubling your costs and jumping up to just over $270, but that's still very, very cheap if they sound good. Before we get to that though, it is worth talking about the big orange elephant in the room, and that's the orange volume knob. If you're running this in mono, you're now going to have two volume controls to think about. You're likely though also going to be running from a preamp, and that's going to have its own volume control already. And so the easiest way to set these up is just to max out the volume, control all the volume from your preamp. There's no remote control from these, so it's not as though you can do any kind of sitting back remote control with your ZA3, and therefore your preamp is probably going to be the better choice. Now at this point, if you're at all familiar with the Fosi Audio range, you might be wondering why you wouldn't just buy the Fosi Audio V3 Mono. The V3 Mono is smaller and simpler, but I've got two very good reasons why you might want to consider the ZA3 instead. I'll give you those two reasons in just a moment, but before we do, the final things I wanted to mention is that if you are maxing out the volume control on the ZA3 or ZA3s if you're running dual mono, it is worth noting that you're going to hear any pops or clicks or other noise that anything higher up the chain is going to send down the line. And that's going to be true for any power amp at all. So do be aware of that if you've got a preamp or other source that creates pops in the system when you turn it on and off. If you've got the ZA3s maxed out somewhere down the line in your source chain, they're also going to be maximally amplifying any pops and crackles from your system. It's just an unfortunate side effect of a setup like this. But let's get back to what's important now and talk about sound quality, because that's where the rubber hits the road or the sound waves hit our eardrums. Running the ZA3 as a stereo integrated amp, so just running one of them and using its built-in volume control, or even running it as a stereo power amp and using an external volume control, the ZA3 sounds good but not exceptional. In other words, I think you're getting very good sound for the price you pay for the ZA3, but it's not leaping up and beating high-level price products. Compared to the similar FX Audio L07 amp that I'll be reviewing very soon on the channel, make sure you subscribe if you want to see that one, I'd say that the ZA3 has just a slightly better tonality to it. It's got a smoother, richer tone that for me better fills in the mid-range, whereas the L07 is a bit crisper, a little bit V-shaped in some ways. And so for those looking for a cleaner, crisper sound for your particular speakers, your room or your preferences, the L07 might be preferable in some situations. I personally prefer the ZA3 with my Harbath P3 ESR XDs in my office here, because it just fills in the mid-range really nicely on my particular setup. So some of that's going to be system synergy, some of that's going to be the room, and some of that's my personal preferences. But the short version is that I think the ZA3 is very good for what you pay for it. If you compare the ZA3 to a higher level product though, like say an SMSL A0200 Mark II, you really do hear where your money's going in the more expensive product. The AO200 Mark II delivers what I would consider to be generally equivalent tonality, but at the same time delivers better clarity, better definition, better resolution of the sound. And that leads to a better sense of soundstage size, width, separation, and focus of images. In short, I think the ZA3 makes a lot of sense as an excellent budget stereo speaker amp, but it's not knocking giants off their perch. If you use a pair of ZA3s in a dual mono setup though, now things are a bit different. Suddenly the staging, the separation, and the imaging focus gets way tighter, way larger, way better. Now they're starting to compete with much more expensive products. Of course, now you've also got two boxes, that's two ZA3s, compared to just one with something like an AO200 Mark II, so you need to take that into account. That's more cables, more boxes, more power supplies. And you're also going to need to run trigger cables to make sure both of these switch on at the right time and you don't have to manually go over and click the power buttons, which is the volume control. And on that note, while we're talking about trigger cables, I think it's a real shame that companies like Fosi Audio are not including the 12-volt trigger cables in the boxes with amps like the ZA3. And Fosi Audio aren't the only culprits here. There's multiple companies that are selling products with 12-volt triggers and not providing the cables, and I think that's a shame. The 3.5mm to 3.5mm cable that you need for a 12-volt trigger is very cheap. It doesn't need to be high quality, it can be very cheap, very basic. But I think it's a shame that you'd get a product like this, you'd go to set it up, and then you're going to have to take another trip to the store or get online and wait for a delivery just to get your system set up the way you want it, when it's probably a cable worth a matter of cents and therefore should be included in the box in my opinion. Of course, an alternative is to have an auto on-off feature that uses incoming signal to tell the amplifier when to switch on and then when to switch off after the signal goes away, and that's included in the Fosi Audio V3 Mono that I mentioned before. And in fact, the V3 Mono offers much of what the ZA3 offers and possibly even more. The V3 Mono here is smaller, it's got auto power on off so it doesn't need a 12-volt trigger, there's no volume control to worry about, and it offers that PFFB circuit that I spoke about earlier. Theoretically, that makes the V3 Mono the better amplifier here. After all, the PFFB circuit that I mentioned before is designed to make sure that the speaker load interacting with your amplifier doesn't change how it performs. It doesn't influence the quality of the treble coming out of a Class D amplifier. But maybe it's not quite that simple. What I found as I compared the V3 Mono with the ZA3 was that they both have very good sound in general terms, but they're also a little bit different. There's a naturalness in the tonal quality of the ZA3 that I never quite noticed from the V3 Mono, even though the V3 Mono is also excellent for the price. It's impossible for me to cite exactly what to listen for if you were comparing these two, because it's more of an intangible thing. I can't say go to track X and listen for this, because it's just a general quality of the sound overall that I prefer from the ZA3. It's more natural, more lifelike, more realistic, more full-bodied but not thicker. It just sounds more real. It's pure speculation on my part, but I can't help but wonder if somewhere that post-filter feedback circuit, or PFFB, if that's somehow changing the tonality of the amplifier. Feedback circuits by their very nature will tend to smear the timing of the sound ever so slightly. It's not enough that we'd ever consciously perceive the difference between a circuit being on and circuit being off in terms of the timing of it, but our brains are infinitely sensitive to timing accuracy. The specific timing of every single sound that ever reaches our ears is what our brains use to piece together the sonic world around us. And so there's a good chance that any erosion of timing accuracy by a circuit like a PFFB circuit could actually be affecting our brain's ability to perceive the sound as naturally as possible. In other words, a circuit with less feedback and therefore closer to perfect timing will sound more natural to our ears because our brains can interpret it better. Again, this is speculation, but it's the only thing I can think of that would explain why the ZA3 sounds more natural than the already excellent V3 Mono. So would I choose the ZA3s over the V3 Monos based on what I've said so far? No. The V3 Mono is still the better amplifier. It's more convenient, the auto on-off feature is great, the size is great, the lack of a volume control is great. In many ways, it is still the better amplifier, even though the ZA3 is just a hair more natural. But that is before the ZA3 plays its trump card. If you know the ZA3 already, you might think I'm referring to the fact that the ZA3 offers a subwoofer output. In other words, you can run a subwoofer directly from the ZA3, which could be handy if you're not running a preamp, or if your preamp doesn't have a subwoofer output, the ZA3 can take care of that for you. But that's not it. Where the ZA3 runs away with it for me is its size. Its weakness, being bigger, is also its strength. By being just that little bit bigger, and yes, it's significantly bigger, but in the scheme of power amplifiers, it's not. By being just that little bit bigger, it opens up a world of opportunities with op amps. And that allows the ZA3 to transform into a beast of an amplifier. But let me explain. If you open both the V3 mono and the ZA3, you'll find inside a series of little silicon op amp chips. The stock op amps in both the V3 mono and the ZA3 are the NE5532 op amps, which are okay, but they're nothing special. Even a set of relatively cheap op amps like the OPA 1656s will significantly increase the performance of both of these. In the V3 mono though, you are a little bit limited by the size of the case. The biggest and the best op amp that you can fit inside the V3 mono, based on everything I've tried, is the Sparkos Labs SS3602. It's a lovely op amp, but one that's a little bit too smooth for the already slightly smooth sound of the V3 mono and indeed the ZA3. But the ZA3 is bigger, and that means more height in the case. And that means you can fit this. This is the V7 Vivid op amp from Burson Audio, and it transforms the ZA3 into a giant killer. The V7 Vivids take everything that's already good about the ZA3 and boost it. With two V7 Vivids installed, one in the right channel op amp socket and one in the XLR op amp socket, you'll be enjoying significantly improved mid-range detail and general nuance through the mid-range as well. You'll also find that the sonic image is better focused, all sounds are better separated, and the overall soundstage is probably a little tiny bit wider as well. That bit's harder to gauge because there's a time delay when swapping the op amps around, but I'm pretty confident that the soundstage does improve in width and size overall. What I can definitely say is that focus, image separation, detail retrieval and nuance of the sound, in other words hearing the subtleties of a vocal for instance, that's all significantly improved with the V7 Vivids. I should mention that you can run the V7 Vivids in all of the different sockets within the ZA3, and so if you're running it in a stereo setup, you can put the V7 Vivid in the left and the right channel op amp sockets, as well as in the XLR socket. Theoretically, you could put it in the subwoofer sockets as well, but I don't know that you're really going to get a lot of benefit in putting an op amp of this level in a subwoofer socket. Because it's only handling bass, you're not going to get some of the benefits of soundstage and image focus and soundstage size and clarity. Those things are going to be lost a little bit from a subwoofer. Having said that, I don't run a subwoofer at the moment, so I can't specifically test it, but I would probably be erring towards something like an OPA 1656 for the sub and save the V7 Vivids for your main full range 2-channel setup. Now, of course, if you're going to be buying the V7 Vivids, you're going to be buying them, and that means $160 per pair. So in other words, if you're running a pair of ZA3s in mono mode, you're going to have to spend $169 on each of them. That means that you're now running a $610 speaker setup. So it is a big jump, but to my ears it sounds like a worthwhile one. To me, running a pair of ZA3s in mono mode with V7 Vivid op amps in the appropriate sockets in each sounds like a $600 or more amplification setup. And I do think it probably is actually performing even higher than the $600 price tag. After all, the op amps are probably the most important part of the signal pathway alongside the amplification chip, the TPA3255 within this amp, and you can't change that. So upgrading the op amps is a little bit like upgrading the engine in your car. It's going to have a big impact. To take that a step further for you, if I wasn't already rocking the Burson Audio Timekeeper GT mono blocks, which are way more expensive, I'd be running a set of ZA3s with the V7 Vivids. As it is, I've actually seriously considered taking the Timekeepers out of my system and running the ZA3s just purely to reduce the amount of size taken up by my amplification. There's no doubt the Timekeeper GTs are better, as they should be, but the ZA3s sound so good that it's a compromise I'd be very happy to make. They also don't need to run fans because they're not as powerful. they're not running the high idling current, they're not class A like the timekeepers are, at least for the first few watts. And so the ZA3 is a very, very compelling offering. Remember that if the $600 price tag sounds too much for you, even just upgrading them to the $20-odd OPA 1656s, that will be I think $20 per amplifier, even then you're going to be getting a fantastic amplifier. And so if you want to try the ZA3s for yourself, I'll put links in the description down below as always. Likewise, as always, I want to say a huge thanks to channel members, to channel Patreon members, and to those of you that leave super thanks on videos like this one. And if this is your first exposure to the world of op amps and op amp rolling or swapping out these chips, I'll put a link to a video up here where I talk all about the V7 Vivid, the V7 Classic, compare them to the Sparkos Labs op amps, tell you a little bit more about the op amp world. So click that one next if you want to know more about that. But for now, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.